Good evening, everybody. I'm going to do another read aloud. This is part 4 of Michael Ende's Momo, a children's book about the gray men and stealing people's time. And so this is part 4. Just sort of a little recap if you missed the last read aloud session. In it, the gray men who steal everyone's time. There was an agent that came to the amphitheater and tried to tempt the little girl Momo with a doll, and it was a very lifelike sort of robotic doll. And Momo didn't really know how to play with it because the doll would talk, but it would just repeat the same things over and over. And then eventually the man was like, no, she wants things. She wants things. And so he was bringing all of these dresses and outfits and toys and then a boyfriend. And it was all about acquiring things. And Momo wasn't that interested. And so eventually he threw it all. He became mesmerized by her. And then he threw all the stuff in the car and left. And then Momo found out that they were stealing everybody's time. So they gathered their friends together and they told all the children what was happening with the gray men. And Guido Guide, who was her younger good friend, he wanted to be go out and tell everyone and sort of take on this heroic role. And the older friend, Beppo, he was concerned because he thought that these were very dangerous people. And so he was very much more cautious. But Guido, the young man, he was all about doing some sort of big flamboyant thing. And so they had all the children gather together and have a big parade and make all these signs about the gray men to tell the adults what was happening and why everyone was so unhappy that their time was being stolen. And they were going to have a big gathering in the amphitheater a few days afterwards, but it turns out that like no adults came. And so it was just the kids and everybody was really disappointed. And so that happened. And then ultimately the agent who was responsible, who sort of tipped the hand and told Momo what was actually going on, he was brought up to trial in the garbage dump in the middle of the night. And he was found guilty of conveying, the secret plans of the gray men. And so they took away all of his time, and then he shriveled up into nothing and blew away. So now we're on chapter 10. Chapter 10 is called More Haste, Less Speed. Old Beppo was pedaling, that's the older friend, through the darkness on his squeaky bicycle, pedaling with all his might. The gray judge's words still rang in his ears. We shall certainly devote some attention to this unusual child, that's Momo. You may rest assured that this child will never harm us again. We shall neutralize her by every available means. Momo was in dire peril. Of that there could be no doubt. He must go to her at once and warn her and protect her from the men in gray. He didn't know how, but he would find a way. So Beppo pedaled even faster, his tuft of white hair fluttering in the breeze. He still had a very long way to go. The ruined amphitheater was ablaze with the headlights of a whole fleet of smart gray cars, which hemmed it in on every side. Dozens of men in gray were scurrying up and down the grass-grown steps. And at last, after peering into every nook and cranny, they came upon the hole in the wall. And some of them scrambled through it into Momo's room, and they looked under the bed. They even looked inside the little brick stove. And then they reappeared, patted the dust from their smart gray suits, and shrugged. The bird appears to have flown, said one. It's exasperating, said another. Children should be safely tucked in bed at this hour, not gallivanting around in the dark. I don't like the look of this, said a third. It's almost as if someone had tipped her off just in time. And I forgot, actually, she did have a little visitor come, and it was a tortoise, and the tortoise's shell would spell out letters, and now those were the instructions. So they're communicating, and so the tortoise led her off into safety. Impossible, said the first. He couldn't have known of our intention before we knew it ourselves, or could he? The three of them eyed each other in dismay. If someone really did tip her off, the third pointed out, she'd have made herself scarce. We'll only be wasting time if we go on looking for her here. Well, what do you suggest then? I say we should notify headquarters at once so they can launch a full-scale manhunt. Well, the first thing they'll ask, and quite rightly so, is whether we've made a thorough search of the immediate neighborhood. Very well, said the first speaker. Let's search the area first, but if the girl's well clear of it already, we'll be making a big mistake. Nonsense, snapped his colleague. Even if she is, headquarters can still launch a full-scale manhunt using every available agent. The The girl won't escape. She doesn't stand a chance. Right, gentlemen, let's get going. You all know what is at stake. And many of the local inhabitants lay awake that night, wondering why so many cars kept racing past their windows. Even the narrowest side streets and roughest farm tracks resounded until daybreak, with a roar of traffic more usually heard on major roads. No one could sleep a wink. All this time, Momo was trudging slowly through the city in the wake of her newfound friend, the tortoise. The city never slept nowadays, however late the hour. Interminable streams of people surged through the streets, jostling and elbowing each other aside. The roads were choked with cars and big, noisy, overcrowded buses. Neon signs blazed down from every building, intermittently bathing passersby in their multicolored glare. Momo, who had never seen any of this before, followed the tortoise in kind of a wide eyed, waking dream. They made their way across broad squares and down brightly lit streets. Cars flashed past them and pedestrians milled around them, but no one looked twice at the child and the tortoise. They never had to get out of anyone's way either. Nobody bumped into them, nor did any driver have to brake to avoid them. The tortoise seemed to know precisely when there would be no car or pedestrian in their path, and so they never had to vary their pace. They never had to hurry or to stop and wait. And Momo began to wonder how any two creatures could walk so slowly but travel so fast. When Beppo finally reached the amphitheater, the feeble glow of his bicycle lamp showed him, even before he dismounted, that the ground around it was a mass of tire tracks. He left his bicycle in the grass and ran to the hole in the wall. Momo! He whispered the name at first, and then he spoke it aloud. Momo! He repeated. No answer. Beppo swallowed hard. His throat felt so dry, and he climbed through the hole into the pitch-black room, stumbled over something, and wrenched his ankle. Striking a match with tremulous fingers, he peered in all directions. The crude little table and chairs were overturned, the blankets and mattress stripped off the bed. Of Momo herself, there was no sign at all. Beppo bit his lip to stifle the hoarse sob that racked his chest at the sight of this desolation. My God, he muttered, I'm too late. She's gone. They've spirited the poor girl away. What shall I do now? What can I do? And just then the match began to burn his fingers, and so he dropped it and stood there in the dark. Making his way outside as fast as his twisted ankle would allow, he hobbled over to his bicycle, struggled back into the saddle, and pedaled off. Guido must help, he kept repeating. He must. Pray heaven I can find him. He knew that Guido planned to earn some extra money by spending Sunday nights in the storeroom of a car breaker's junkyard. Serviceable parts had been disappearing of late, and it was Guido's job to see that this pilfering ceased. When Beppo ran him to ground in a shed behind the junkyard and hammered on the door with a fist, Guido at first mistook him for a would-be stealer of spare parts and kept mum. And then, recognizing the old man's voice, he unlocked the door. What's the matter? He grumbled. It's Momo, Beppo told him breathlessly. She's in danger. What are you talking about? Asked Guido, flopping down on his camp bed. Momo? Why? What's happened to her? I don't know exactly, Beppo panted, but it doesn't look good. And he told Guido all that he had seen, from the trial on the garbage dump to the tire tracks around the amphitheater to Momo's ransacked and deserted room. It took quite a while to get it all out, and of course, because not even the concern or anxiety he felt for Momo could make him speak any faster than he usually did. I knew it all along, he concluded. I knew it would end in disaster, and well, now they've taken their revenge. They've kidnapped her. We've got to help her, Guido, but how? How? The blood had slowly drained from Guido's cheeks while Beppo was speaking. He felt as if the ground had given way beneath him. Till now, he regarded the whole affair as a splendid game and taken it neither more or less seriously than any game or story. But now, for the first time ever, a story had escaped from his control. It had taken on a life of its own, and all the imagination in the world would be insufficient to halt it. He felt numb. You know, Beppo, he said after a while, Momo may have simply gone for a walk. I mean, she does that occasionally, like the time she went roaming around the countryside for 3 whole days and nights. I mean, we may be worrying for no good reason. What about the tire tracks? Beppo demanded angrily. What about the state of her room? Guido refused to be drawn. Suppose they really did come looking for her, he said. Who's to say they found her? I mean, perhaps she'd gone by the time they got there. Why else would they have searched the place, and turned it upside down? But what if they did find her? Beppo shouted. What then? He gripped his young friend by the lapels and shook him. Don't be a fool, Guido. The men in gray are real. I tell you, we've got to do something and fast. Steady on, Guido said soothingly, startled by the old man's vehemence. Of course we'll do something, but not before we've thought it over carefully. I mean, after all, we don't even know where to look for her. Beppo released him. Well, I'm going to the police, he announced. You can't do that, Guido protested with a look of horror. Have some sense, Beppo. Suppose they found her. Don't you know what they do with her? Don't you know where waifs and strays end up? They'd stick her in a home with bars over the windows, and you wouldn't want that, would you? No, Beppo muttered helplessly. Of course not, but what if she's really in trouble? But what if she isn't? Guido argued. What if she's only gone for a bit of a ramble and you set the police on her? I mean, I wouldn't like to be in your shoes then. I mean, she might never want to see you again. Beppo subsided onto the chair and buried his face in his hands. I just don't know what to do, he groaned. I just don't know. Well, said Guido, I vote we wait till tomorrow or the day after before we do anything at all. I mean, if she isn't back, okay, well, then we'll go to the police. But my guess is everything will have sorted itself out long before then. And the three of us will be laughing about the whole silly business. You think so? Muttered Beppo, suddenly overcome with fatigue. The day's excitements had been a bit too much for a man of his age. Of course, Guido assured him. And he eased Beppo's boots off and wrapped his sprained ankle in a damp cloth and then helped him onto the camp bed. Don't worry, he said softly. Everything's going to be fine. But Beppo was already asleep, and sighing, Guido stretched out on the floor with his jacket under his head in place of a pillow. Sleep eluded him, though. I mean, he couldn't stop thinking about the men in gray all night long, and for the first time in his happy-go-lucky life, he felt frightened. The time-saving bank had launched a full-scale manhunt. Every agent in the city was instructed by headquarters to drop everything else and concentrate on finding the girl known as Momo. Every street teemed with gray figures. They lay in wait on the rooftops, and they lurked in the sewers, and they staked out the airport and the railway stations, and they kept an unobtrusive watch on buses and trams. I mean, in short, they were everywhere all at once. But they still didn't find the girl known as Momo. I say, Tortoise, said Momo, as the pair of them made their way across the darkened courtyard. Aren't you going to tell me where you're taking me? Some letters took shape on the tortoise's shell. Don't be scared, they read. Well, I'm not, said Momo when she deciphered them, though she said it more to boost her courage than anything else. Truth to tell, she did feel rather apprehensive. The tortoise's route was becoming steadily more torturous and erratic. It had already taken them across parks, over bridges, through subways, into buildings, and along corridors, even once or twice through cellars. Had Momo known that she was being hunted by a whole army of men in gray, she probably would have felt uneasier still, but she didn't. So she followed the tortoise patiently, step by step, as it continued to meander along. And it was lucky she did. I mean, just as the creature had previously threaded its way through traffic, so it now seemed to know exactly when and where their pursuers would appear. There were times when the men in gray reached a spot only moments after they themselves had passed it. But the hunters and the hunted never actually bumped into each other. It's a good thing I've learned to read so well, Momo remarked casually, isn't it? And instantly the tortoise's shell flashed a warning. Shh! Momo couldn't understand the reason for this injunction, but she obeyed it. And then she saw 3 dim gray shapes flit past a few feet away. They had now reached a part of the city where each building looked drabber and shabbier than the last. Towering tenements with peeling walls flanked streets pitted with potholes full of stagnant water. The whole neighborhood was dark and deserted. At long last, word reached the headquarters of the Time Savings Bank that Momo had been sighted. Excellent, said the duty officer. Have you taken her into custody? No, she disappeared before we could nab her, and she seemed just to vanish from the face of the earth, and we've lost track of her again. How did that happen? If only we knew. There's something fishy going on. Well, where was she when you sighted her? Well, that's the odd thing. She was in a part of the city completely unknown to us. There's no such place, said the duty officer. There must be. I mean, it seems to be, how shall I put it, right on the very edge of time. And the girl was heading that way. What? Yelped the duty officer. After her again? You've got to catch her before she gets there at all costs. Is that clear? Understood, sir, came the ashen voice answer. Momo might almost have imagined that day was breaking, except the strange glow appeared so suddenly just as they turned a corner, to be exact. It wasn't dark anymore, nor was it light, nor did the glow resemble the half-light of dawn or dusk. It was a radiance that outlined every object with unnatural crispness and clarity, yet it seemed to come from nowhere, or rather, from everywhere at once. The long black shadows cast by everything, even the tiniest pebble, ran in all directions, as if the tree over there were lit from the left, the building over there from the right, the monument over there from dead ahead. And the monument, if that's what it was, looked like weird enough in itself. It consisted of a big square block of black stone surmounted by a gigantic white egg. Nothing more. And the houses, too, were unlike any Momo had ever seen, with dazzling white walls and windows cloaked in shadow, so dark and dense that it was impossible to tell whether anyone lived inside. Somehow, though, Momo sensed that these houses hadn't been built for people to live in, but for some mysterious and quite different purpose. The streets were completely empty, not only of people, but of dogs and cats and birds and cars. Not a movement or a breath of wind disturbed the utter stillness. The whole district might have been encased in glass. Although the tortoise was plodding along more slowly than ever, Momo again found herself marveling at their rate of progress. Beyond the borders of this strange part of town, where it was still nighttime, 3 smart gray limousines came racing down the potholed streets with headlights blazing, and each was manned by several agents, and one of them, who was in the leading car, caught sight of Momo just as she turned into the street with the white houses and the unearthly glow coming from it. And when they reached the corner, however, something quite incomprehensible happened. The convoy came to a sudden stop. The drivers stepped out on their accelerators. The engines roared and the wheels spun, but the cars themselves refused to budge. They might have as well have been on a conveyor belt traveling at exactly the same speed, but in the opposite direction. And the more they accelerated, the faster it went. But by the time the men in gray grasped the truth, Momo was almost out of sight. And cursing, they jumped out and tried to overtake her on foot. They sprinted hard, grimacing with rage and exertion, but much the same thing happened. And when they were finally compelled to give up, they had covered a mere 10 yards. Meanwhile, Momo had disappeared among the snow-white houses and was nowhere to be seen. Well, that's that, said one of the gray men. It's no use. We'll never catch her now. Why were we rooted onto the spot? Demanded another. I just don't understand it. Neither do I, said the first. The only question is, will they take that into our favor when we come back empty-handed? You mean they may put us on trial? Well, they certainly won't give us a pat on the back. All the agents looked downcast. Perching on the wings and bumpers of their gray limousines, they brooded on the price of failure. There was no point in hurrying, not now. Far, far away by this time, somewhere in the maze of deserted snow-white streets and squares, Momo continued to follow the tortoise. Despite their leisurely progress, or because of it, the streets and buildings seemed to flash past in a white blur. The tortoise turned yet another corner, and Momo followed close behind, stopping short in amazement. The street ahead of them was unlike all the rest. It really was more of an alleyway than a street. The close-packed buildings on either side were a mass of little turrets, gables, and balconies. They resembled dainty glass palaces, which, after lying on the seabed since time out of mind, had suddenly risen to the surface. Draped in seaweed and encrusted with barnacles and coral, they shimmered gently with all of the iridescent rainbow hues of mother of pearl. The narrow street ended in a house detached from all the others, and standing at right angles to them, its big bronze front door was richly decorated with ornamental figures. Momo glanced up at the street sign immediately above her. It was a slab of white marble, and on it, in gold lettering, were the words, "Never Lane." Although she had taken only a second or two to look at the sign and read it, the tortoise was already far ahead and had almost reached the house at the end of the lane. "Wait for me, tortoise," she called, but for some strange reason she couldn't hear her own voice. The tortoise seemed to have heard, though, because it paused and looked around, and Momo tried to follow, but no sooner had she set off down Never Lane than a curious sensation gripped her. She felt as if she were toiling upstream against a mighty torrent or battling with an inaudible tempest that threatened to blow her backwards. Bent almost double, she braced her body against the mysterious force, hauling herself along hand over hand or crawling on all fours. She could just make out the little figure of the tortoise waiting patiently at the end of the lane. "I'm getting nowhere," she called at last. "Help me, can't you?" And slowly the tortoise retraced its steps, and when it came to a halt in front of her, its shell bore the following advice: walk backwards. So Momo tried it, and she turned around and walked backwards, and all at once she was progressing up the lane with the utmost ease. At the same time, something most peculiar happened to her. While walking backwards, she was also thinking, breathing, and feeling backwards, living backwards, in fact. And at length, she bumped into something solid, and turning, she found she was standing outside the last house of all, the one that stood at right angles to the rest. And she gave a little start because, seen at this range, the ornate bronze door looked enormous. "I wonder if I'll ever get it open," she thought. But at that moment, the massive door swung open by itself. She paused again, distracted by the sight of another sign above the door. This one, which was supported by the figure of a unicorn carved in ivory, read, "Nowhere House." And because she was still rather slow at reading, the door had begun to close again by the time she'd finished. She slipped hurriedly inside, and it shut behind her with a sound like muffled thunder. Momo found herself in a long, lofty passage, flanked at regular intervals by marble statues whose apparent function was to support the ceiling. There was no sign here of the mysterious current that prevailed outside in the lane, and Momo followed the tortoise as it waddled ahead of her down the long corridor. And at the far end, it stopped outside of a little door just big enough for Momo to duck through. "We're there," the tortoise's shell announced. There was a little sign on the door, and kneeling down so that it was on a level with her nose, Momo read the inscription. "Professor Secundus Minutus Ora," it said. And she drew a deep breath and boldly lifted the latch. And as soon as the little door opened, her ears were assailed by a melodious chorus of tinkling and chiming and ticking and humming and whirring. And she followed the tortoise inside, and the latch clicked into place behind her. Chapter 11, The Conference. Innumerable figures were scurrying around the headquarters of the time-saving bank, a gray-lit labyrinth of passages and corridors passing on the latest news in agitated whispers. Every member of the directional board had been summoned to attend an extraordinary general meeting. Some surmised that this portended a dire emergency, others that new and untapped sources of time had been discovered. The directors were already closeted in the boardroom, and they sat side by side at a conference table so long that it seemed to go on forever, each with his steel gray briefcase and small gray cigar. They had removed their bowler hats for the occasion, and every last one of them had a bald head as gray as the rest of him. And their mood, if such bloodless creatures could be said to have feelings at all, was universally dejected. The chairman rose from his place at the head of the long table. The hum of conversation died away, and two interminable rows of gray faces turned towards him. "Gentlemen," he began, "the situation is grave. I feel bound to acquaint you at once with the unpalatable but inescapable facts of the matter. Every available agent was assigned to hunt down the girl named Momo. This operation lasted a total of 6 hours, 13 minutes, and 8 seconds. While engaged on it, all said agents were inevitably compelled to neglect the true purpose of their existence, namely time gathering. And to this loss of revenue must be added the time expended during the manhunt by our agents themselves. Accurate computations disclose that the sum of these two debit entries amounts to 3,738,259,114 seconds. That, gentlemen, is more than a whole human lifetime. I need hardly tell you what such a deficit means to us." Here he pointed dramatically to a huge steel door bristling with combination locks and safety devices set in the wall at the far end of the boardroom. Our reserves of time are not inexhaustible, gentlemen, he pursued in a louder voice. If the manhunt had paid off, well and good, and as it is, we wasted time to no purpose. The girl has eluded us. There must be no repetition of this disastrous affair. I shall strongly oppose any more such time consuming operations from now on. Time must be saved, not squandered. I would therefore urge you to frame your future plans accordingly. That is all I have to say, gentlemen. Thank you for your attention. And he sat down, blowing out a dense cloud of smoke. Agitated whispers ran the length of the boardroom. And then at the other end of the table, a second speaker rose to his feet. Every head turned in his direction. Gentlemen, he said, we all have the interest of the time-saving bank at heart. However, I find it quite unnecessary for us to view this affair with alarm, still less to regard it as a catastrophe. Nothing could be further from the truth. We all know that our reserves of time are so immense that our position would not be endangered even by a loss many times greater than the ones that we have just sustained. What is a human lifetime, after all? By our standards, a mere pinprick. I fully agree with our chairman that there must be no repetition of this incident. On the other hand, nothing like it has ever happened before, and the chances of it happening again are very remote. The chairman was right to reproach us for allowing the girl to escape. On the other hand, our sole purpose was to render her harmless, and that we have successfully done. The creature has disappeared. She has fled beyond the borders of time. We are rid of her, in other words. Personally, I feel we have every reason to congratulate ourselves. The second speaker sat down with a complacent smile. The smattering of applause that greeted his remarks was cut short when a third speaker rose, this time from a seat halfway along the great table. I shall be brief, he said sourly. In my opinion, the last speaker's soothing words were thoroughly irresponsible. This Momo is no ordinary child. We all know she possesses powers capable of presenting a serious threat to us and our activities. The fact that no such incident has ever occurred before is no guarantee that it will not occur again. We must remain on our guard. We must not rest content until the child is in our power, because only then can we be sure that she will never harm us again. Having managed to leave the realm of time, she may re-enter it at any moment, and she will, you mark my words. He sat down. The other directors winced and bowed their heads in silence. Gentlemen, said a fourth speaker, who was sitting across the table from the third, pardon me for being blunt, but we are dodging the issue. We must face the fact that an alien power is meddling in our business. After carefully examining every aspect of the situation, I find that the odds against any creature crossing the borders of time alive and unaided are precisely 42 million to 1. In other words, it's a near impossibility. Another buzz of agitation ran around the boardroom. Everything suggests, the fourth speaker continued, when the murmurs had subsided, that someone helped the girl to elude us. You all know who I mean. The person in question titles himself Professor Ora, Hora. At the sound of his name, most of the men in gray flinched as if they had been struck, and others jumped to their feet, shouting and gesticulating. The fourth speaker raised his arms for silence. Gentlemen, gentlemen, he cried, a little self-control, if you please. I'm well aware that any mention of that name is, well, not quite proper, and I utter it with extreme reluctance, I assure you, but we mustn't blind ourselves to the facts. If the girl received assistance from the aforesaid, he must have had his reasons, and those reasons cannot be other than detrimental to us. In short, gentlemen, we must allow for the possibility that the aforesaid may not only send the girl back, but arm her against us in some way. And she will then be a mortal danger to us. And we must therefore be prepared not merely to sacrifice another human lifetime or lifetimes. No, gentlemen, in this last resort, we must stake everything we possess. I repeat, everything, because if the worst happens, the rift could spell our destruction. I think you know what I'm getting at. The director's agitation mounted, and they all started talking at once. A fifth speaker jumped onto his chair and waved his arms wildly. Quiet, he bellowed. It's all very well for the last speaker to hint at a host of dire possibilities, but he obviously doesn't know how to deal with them himself. He says we must be prepared for any sacrifice. Well and good. We must stop at nothing. Well and good. We mustn't stint on our resources. Well and good. But these are just empty words. Let him tell us what practical steps to take. None of us knows how the aforesaid will arm the girl against us. We shall be confronted by a wholly unknown danger, and that is the problem we have to solve. The boardroom was in uproar now. Some of the directors shouted incoherently, and others drummed on the table with their fists, and others buried their heads in their hands, and all were overcome with panic. The sixth speaker strove hard to make himself heard above the din. Gentlemen, please, he kept repeating in a soothing voice until peace was finally restored. I implore you to take a calm and common sense view of this matter. Even assuming that the girl comes back from the aforesaid, and even assuming that he arms her against us in some way, there will be absolutely no need for us to do battle with her ourselves. We are not particularly well equipped for such a confrontation, as the lamentable fate of our late employee, agent number BLW/553/C, has so amply demonstrated. But that won't be necessary. We have human accomplices in plenty, gentlemen. Provided we make discreet and skillful use of them, we shall be able to dispose of the girl Momo and the threat she represents without ever having to intervene in person. Such a method of procedure would, I feel sure, be not only economical, but safe and highly effective. A sigh of relief went up from the assembled throng. The directors found this a sensible suggestion and would probably have adopted it on the spot had not the floor been claimed by someone seated near the head of the table. Gentlemen, he began, we keep debating how best to get rid of the girl Momo. Our motive, let's be honest, is fear, but fear is a bad counselor. I feel we are missing a golden opportunity, a unique opportunity. There is a saying, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em. Well, why shouldn't we persuade the girl to join us? Why not get her on our side? Hear, hear, cried a number of voices. Go on. It seems clear, the seventh speaker continued, that this child has found her way to the aforesaid. In other words, she got there via the route that has eluded us for so long. And if she can find it again, and she probably can with ease, she could lead us there. And then we shall be able to deal with the aforesaid in our own way, very speedily too, I feel sure. And once that is done, we need no longer toil at gathering time by the hour, minute, and second. No, gentlemen, because we shall have captured mankind's whole store of time at a stroke, and possessing the whole of time means wielding absolute power. Just think, gentlemen, we shall have attained our goal, and all because of the girl you propose to eliminate. A deathly hush had descended on the boardroom. That's all very well, protested someone, but you know it's impossible to lie to the girl. Remember what happened to agent number BLW/553/C? We'd all end up like him. Who said anything about lying to her? Retorted the seventh speaker. We tell her all about our plan, naturally, and then she'd never go along with it, the skeptic persisted. The whole idea is preposterous. Don't be too sure, my friend, a ninth speaker broke in. We'd have to make her a tempting proposition. For instance, we could promise her as much time as she wants. And break our promise later, of course, said the skeptic. The ninth speaker gave an icy smile. Of course not. If we didn't mean what we said, she'd sense it at once. No, cried the chairman, banging the table. I couldn't agree to that. If we really gave her all the time she wanted, it could cost us a fortune. Hardly that, the ninth speaker said blandly. I mean, how much time can one child consume after all? I mean, true, it would be a minor drain on our resources, but think what we'd be getting in return. The time of everyone else in the world. Momo would consume very little, and the little she did consume would simply have to be charged to overheads. I mean, consider the advantages, gentlemen. The ninth speaker resumed his seat while everyone weighed the pros and cons. All the same, the sixth speaker said eventually it wouldn't work. Why not? Well, for the simple reason, I'm afraid, that the girl already possesses all the time she wants, and there would be no point in trying to bribe her with something she already has plenty of. Well, then we would have to deprive her of it first, the ninth speaker replied. We're talking in circles, the chairman said wearily. The child's beyond our reach, and that's the whole trouble. A sigh of disappointment ran the length of the boardroom table. May I venture a suggestion? Asked a tenth speaker. The floor is yours, said the chairman. And the tenth speaker gave the chairman a little bow before proceeding. "This girl," he said, "is fond of her friends. She loves devoting her time to others. What would become of her if there was no one left to share it with her? If she won't assist us of her own free will, we must concentrate on her friends instead." He produced a folder from his briefcase and flipped it open. The principal persons concerned are named as Beppo Roadsweeper and Guido Guide. I have also here a list of the children who pay her regular visits. I suggest we simply lure these people away so she can't be in touch with them. What will Momo's abundance of time amount to when she's all on her own? A burden, a positive curse. And sooner or later, she won't be able to stand it anymore. And when that time comes, gentlemen, we shall present her with our terms. I wager 1,000 years to a microsecond that she will show us the way just to get her friends back. Downcast till now, the men in gray raised their heads. Every face broke into a thin-lipped smile of triumph. Every pair of hands applauded. The sound reverberated along interminable passages and corridors like an avalanche of stones rattling down a mountainside. Chapter 12, Nowhere House. Momo was standing in the biggest room she had ever seen. It was bigger than the biggest cathedral or concert hall in the world. Massive columns supported a roof that could be sensed rather than seen in the gloom far above. There were no windows anywhere, and the golden light that wove its way across the immense hall came from countless candles whose flames burned so steadily that they looked like daubs of brilliant paint, requiring no wax at all to keep them alight. The thousand-fold whirring and ticking and humming and chiming that Momo had heard on entering came from innumerable clocks of every shape and size. They reposed on long tables, in glass cabinets, on golden wall brackets, on endless rows of shelves. There were dainty, bejeweled pocket watches, cheap tin alarm clocks, hourglasses, musical clocks with pirouetting dolls on top, sundials, clocks encased in wood and marble, glass clocks, and clocks driven by jets of water. On the walls hung all manner of cuckoo clocks and other clocks with weights and pendulums, some swinging slowly and majestically, and others wagging busily to and fro. All around the room, at first floor level, ran a gallery reached by a spiral staircase. Higher still was another gallery, and above it another, and above it yet another. Clocks were standing or hanging wherever Momo looked. Not only conventional clocks, but spherical timepieces showing what time it was anywhere in the world, and sidereal clocks, large and small, complete with sun, moon, and stars. Arrayed in the middle of the hall were countless bigger clocks, a forest of clocks, as it were, ranging from grandfather clocks to full-size church clocks. Not a moment passed, but one of these innumerable timepieces struck or chimed somewhere or other, for each of them showed a different time. But far from offending the ear, they combined to produce a sound as pleasant and harmonious as the rustle of leaves in a wood in springtime. Momo roamed from place to place, gazing wide-eyed at all of these curiosities. She had paused beside a lavishly ornamented clock on which two tiny dancers, a man and a woman, were standing with hands entwined, and was just about to prod them to see if they would move when he heard a friendly voice behind her. "Ah, so you're back, Cassiopeia," it said. "Did you bring Momo with you?" And turning, Momo looked around and along an avenue between the grandfather clocks and saw a frail old man with silver hair stooping over the tortoise. He was wearing a gold-embroidered frock coat, blue silk knee breeches, white hose, and shoes with big gold buckles. Lace frothed from the cuffs and collar of his coat, and his silver hair was braided into a pigtail at the back. Momo had never seen such a costume before, though anyone less ignorant would have once have recognized it as the height of fashion 2 centuries earlier. "Well," said the gentleman, still bending over the tortoise, "is she here? Where is she then?" He donned a small pair of eyeglasses like old Beppo's, except that these were gold-rimmed, and peered about him. "Here I am," called Momo. The old gentleman came towards her with a beaming smile, both hands extended, and the nearer he drew, the younger he seemed to become. And by the time he had reached Momo's side, seized her hands, and shaken them cordially, he looked little older than herself. "Welcome," he said delightedly. "Welcome to Nowhere House. Permit me to introduce myself, Momo. My name is Ora, Professor Secundus Minutus Ora." "Were you really expecting me?" Momo asked in surprise. "But of course. Why else would I have sent Cassiopeia to fetch you?" He produced a diamond-studded fob watch from his pocket and flipped the lid open. In fact, you're uncommonly punctual, he said with a smile, holding out the watch for her inspection. There were no hands or numerals on the watch face. Momo just saw two very fine superimposed spirals rotating slowly in opposite directions. And every now and then, minute dots of light appeared where the spirals intersected. This watch, said Professor Ora, is known as a crismograph. It actually accurately records crises in the history of mankind, and one of these rare occurrences has just begun. What is a crisis? Asked Momo. Well, it's like this, the professor explained. At certain junctures in the course of existence, unique moments occur when everyone and everything, even the most distant stars, combine to bring about something that could not have happened before and will never happen again. Few people know how to take advantage of these critical moments, unfortunately, and they often pass unnoticed. And when someone does recognize them, however, great things happen in the world. Well, perhaps one needs a watch like yours to recognize them by, said Momo. Professor Ora smiled and shook his head. No, my child, the watch by itself would be no use to anyone. You have to know how to read it as well. And he snapped the watch shut and replaced it in his pocket. And then, noticing Momo's ill-concealed surprise at his personal appearance, he looked down at himself and frowned. Ah, he said, you may be punctual, but I seem to be rather behind the times in fashion. I mean, how unobservant of me. I must put that to right at once. And he clicked his fingers, and in a flash, his costume changed to a black frock coat, stovepipe trousers, and a stand-up collar. Is this any better? He inquired doubtfully, but Momo's look of astonishment was answer enough. No, of course not, he went on quickly. What am I thinking of? Another click of the fingers, and he instantly appeared in an outfit the like of which Momo had never seen, nor had anyone else since it dated from 100 years in the future. Still no good, he asked. Well, never mind, I will get it right in the end. And he clicked his fingers a third time, and at long last he stood there attired in an ordinary suit of the kind men wear today. That's more like it, eh? He said, his eyes twinkling. I hope I didn't alarm you, Momo. It was just a little joke of mine. But now, my girl, come with me. You've a long journey behind you, and I'm sure you would enjoy a hearty breakfast. And he took her by the hand and led her off into the clock forest, with the tortoise following at their heels. And after twisting and turning like a maze, the path eventually came out in a small room whose walls consisted of a gigantic grandfather clock. In one corner stood a bow-legged table, and beside it a dainty little sofa and some matching armchairs. And here, as elsewhere, everything was bathed in the golden glow of a myriad of motionless candle flames. Set out on the table was a pot-bellied jug and two small cups, together with plates, spoons, and knives, all of solid, gleaming gold. There were also two little dishes, one containing golden yellow butter and the other honey, like liquid gold, and a basket piled with crusty golden brown rolls. Professor Ora filled both cups with hot chocolate from the pot-bellied jug and made a gesture of invitation. There, little Momo, please do tuck in. And Momo needed no second bidding. Chocolate you could drink she'd never heard of before. And as for rolls spread with butter and honey, well, these were a rare delicacy. And these rolls tasted more delicious than any she had ever eaten in her life. Completely wrapped up in her wonderful breakfast, she feasted on it with her cheeks bulging and her mind devoid of every other thought. Although she hadn't slept a wink all night long, the food banished her weariness and made her feel fresh and lively. And the more she ate, the better it tasted, and she felt as if she could have gone on eating like that for days on end. Professor Ora, who watched her benevolently, was tactful enough not to cut short her enjoyment too soon by engaging in conversation. He realized that his guest had years of hunger to make up for, and perhaps this was why, while he was watching her, he gradually looked older and older until he became a white-haired old gentleman again. And when he noticed that Momo wasn't too handy with a knife, he spread the rolls for her and put them on her plate. He himself ate little, just enough to keep her company. And at last, even Momo could eat no more. She drank up her chocolate, and studying her host over the rim of the golden cup and wondering who or what he could possibly be, he was no ordinary person, that much was obvious, but all she really knew about him so far was his name, and she put her cup down and cleared her throat. Why did you send the tortoise to fetch me? Well, to protect you from the men in gray, Professor Ora replied gravely. They're searching for you everywhere, and you're only safe from there Here with me. Momo looked startled. You mean they want to hurt me? Yes, my child, the professor sighed in a manner of speaking. But why? Because they're afraid of you, because no one could have done them greater harm. Well, I haven't done anything to them, Momo protested. Oh, yes, you have. You not only persuaded one of them to betray himself, you told your friends about him. And what's more, you and your friends tried to broadcast that truth about the men in gray. Isn't that enough to make you their mortal enemy? But we walked right through the city, the tortoise and I, Momo said, and if they were searching for me everywhere, they could easily have caught us, but we weren't going very fast. The tortoise had stationed herself at the professor's feet, and he took her on his lap and tickled under her chin. Well, Cassiopeia, he said with a smile, what is your opinion? Could they have caught you? The word never appeared like lightning on Cassiopeia's shell, and the letters flickered so merrily that Momo almost thought she detected a dry chuckle. The thing is, said the professor, Cassiopeia can see into the future. Not far, just half an hour or thereabouts, but still. Correction, flashed the shell. Pardon me, said the professor. I should have said half an hour precisely. She knows for certain what will happen in the next 30 minutes, like whether or not she's going to bump into the men in gray, for instance. My goodness, exclaimed Momo, how useful. So if we knew in advance she'd meet the men in gray at such and such a spot, would she simply take a different route? No, Professor Orr replied, I'm afraid it's not as easy as that. She can't undo anything she knows in advance because what she knows is actually what is going to happen. And if she knew she was going to meet the men in gray at a certain spot, she'd meet them there. She would be powerless to prevent it. Momo's face fell. I don't understand, she said. In that case, there's no advantage in knowing anything in advance after all. Well, there is sometimes, said the professor. I mean, in your case, for example, she knew you were going to take a certain route and not meet any men in gray. And that was an advantage, wasn't it? Momo didn't reply. Her thoughts were as tangled as a skein of wool. But to return to you and your friends, the professor went on, I must congratulate you. Your posters and placards were most impressive. You mean you read them? Momo asked delightedly. Every last word, the professor assured her. Nobody else did from the look of it, said Momo. The professor nodded sympathetically. I'm afraid not. The men in gray saw to that. Do you know them well? Momo asked, and he nodded again and sighed. As well as they know me, he said. Momo didn't know what to make of this reply. Do you often go to see them? No, never. I never set foot outside of this house. Well, what about the men in gray? Do they ever come here? The professor smiled. Never fear, Momo. They can't get in. They wouldn't even if they knew the way to Never Lane, which they don't. And Momo thought a while, and though reassured by Professor Hora's remarks, she was eager to learn more about him. How do you come to know all of this, she asked. I mean, about our posters and the men in gray. Well, I keep a constant watch on them and everything connected with them, the professor told her. So I've naturally been watching you and your friends as well. Well, I thought you said you never left the house. I've no need to, said the professor, rapidly growing younger as he spoke, thanks to my omnivision glasses. And he took off his little gold-rimmed spectacles and held them out. Would you care to try them? Momo put them on. I can't make out anything at all, she said, screwing up her eyes and blinking. All she could see was a whirl of colors, lights and shadows. It made her feel kind of dizzy. Yes, she heard the professor say. It's always the same to begin with. Seeing through the omnivision glasses is not as easy as all of that, but you will soon get used to them, though. He stood behind Momo's chair and gently adjusted the position of the frame. And at once, everything sprang into focus. The first thing Momo saw was that the men in gray and their 3 limousines on the edge of the district where the strange white buildings began, and they were in the process of pushing their cars backwards. And then looking farther afield, she saw more gray figures in the city streets, and they were talking and gesticulating excitedly as though passing on information of some kind. It's you they're talking about, Professor Ora explained. They can't understand how you managed to escape. Why are they all so gray in the face? Momo asked, still watching them. Because they feed on dead matter, the professor told her. They live in people's time, as you know, but time dies. I mean, it literally dies. Once it's been wrested away from its rightful owners, all human beings have their own share of time, but it only serves for as long as it really belongs to them. So the men in gray aren't really human? No, their human appearance is only a disguise. Well, what are they then? Well, strictly speaking, they're nothing. Well, so where do they come from? Well, they exist only because people give them the opportunity to do so. Now, naturally, they seize that opportunity. Now that people are giving them a chance to rule their lives, they're naturally taking advantage of that too. Well, what would happen if they couldn't steal any more time? Well, they would disappear into thin air, which is where they come from. Professor Ora took his glasses back and pocketed them. Unfortunately, he continued after a pause, they already had plenty of human accomplices, and that's the worst part. Well, nobody's going to steal any of my time, Momo said stoutly. I should hope not, said the professor. From one moment to the next, he looked like an old man again. Come along, Momo, I want to show you my collection. And taking her hand, he led her back into the great hall where he showed her all sorts of timepieces and made them chime for her and explained the workings of his sidereal clocks. And gradually, under the influence of his little visitor's obvious delight in these marvels, he grew younger again. Tell me, he said as they walked on, do you like riddles? Oh, yes, very much, Momo said eagerly. Do you know any? Yes, said the professor, smiling at her. I know a real teaser, and very few people can solve it. All the better, Momo said. I'll make a special note of it so I can try it out on my friends. And the professor's smile broadened. I can't wait to see if you can solve it. Listen carefully. All dwelling in one house are strange brothers three, as unlike as any three brothers could be. Yet try as you might to tell brother from brother, you'll find out that the trio resemble each other. The first isn't there, though he'll come beyond doubt. The second's departed, so he's not about. The third and the smallest is right on the spot, and managed without him the others could not. Yet the third is a factor with which to be reckoned because the first brother turns into the second. You cannot stand back and observe number three, for one of the others is all you will see. So tell me, child, are the three of them one? Or are there but two? Or could there be none? Just name them, and you will at once realize that each rules a kingdom of infinite size. They rule it together and are it as well, and in that they are alike. So where do they dwell? And Professor Ora gave Momo an encouraging nod. And thanks to her excellent memory, she was able to repeat the entire rhyme word for word, and she did so slowly and carefully. And then sighed. Whew, she said, that's a really hard one. I have no idea what the answer could be. I don't even know where to start. Just try, said the professor. And Momo recited the riddle again under her breath, and finally she shook her head. It's no use, she said. And the tortoise, which she had now rejoined them and was seated at the professor's feet, had been watching Momo intently. Well, Cassiopeia, said the professor, you know everything half an hour in advance. Will Momo solve the riddle, or won't she? Cassiopeia's shell lit up. She will, it spelled out. You see, the professor said, turning to Momo, you are going to solve it. Cassiopeia has never been wrong. Momo knit her brow and racked her brains once more. Who were these three brothers that all lived in the same house? They obviously weren't brothers in the usual sense. In riddles, brothers always meant like grains of sand or teeth or things like similar things at all events. But these three things somehow turned into each other. And what sorts of things could do that? Looking around in search of inspiration, Momo caught sight of the candles with their motionless flame. Fire turned wax into light. Yes, they were three brothers, but that wouldn't be the answer because they were all there at the same time, and two of them weren't supposed to be. Well, what about blossom, fruit, and seed? Could the answer be something of that kind? The more Momo debated this possibility, the more promising it seemed. The seed was the smallest of the three. It was there when the other two weren't. And then the other two couldn't exist without it. But no, that wouldn't do either because a seed was perfectly visible. And the riddle said that anyone looking at the smallest of the three always saw one of the other two. Momo's thoughts flitted hither and thither, and she simply couldn't find a clue that led anywhere. But still, Cassiopeia had predicted she would solve the riddle. So she slowly recited it to herself for the third time. And when she came to the line, the first isn't there, though he'll come beyond doubt, she saw Cassiopeia give her a wink, and the words, what I know, lit up on her shell. but only for a split second. Professor Aura smiling. No helping, Cassiopeia, he said, though he hadn't been looking in her direction. Momo can work it out all by herself. And Momo, who had seen the words, began to ponder their meaning. What was it Cassiopeia knew? She knew the riddle would be solved, but that was no help. So what else did Cassiopeia know? Well, she always knew what was going to happen. She knew the future. The first isn't there, though he'll come beyond doubt. That's the future. Professor Aura nodded. The second's departed, Momo went on, so he's not about. That must be the past. The professor beamed and nodded again. And now comes the hard part, Momo said thoughtfully. Three, what can the third brother be? Now, he's the smallest of the three, but the other two can't manage without him, and he's the only one at home. And another pause for thought, and she gave a sudden exclamation. Of course, it's now. It's this very moment. The past consists of moments gone by, and the future consists of moments to come, so neither of them could exist without the present. That's it. Her cheeks were glowing with excitement now. But what does the next bit mean? Yet the third is a factor with which to be reckoned, because the first brother turns into the second. I suppose it means that the present exists only because the future turns into the past. And she looked at Professor Hora with dawning amazement. Yes, it's true. I guess I never looked at it like that before. If it is true, though, there's really no such thing as the present, only past and future. I mean, take this moment, for instance. By the time I talk about it, it's already in the past. You can't stand back and observe number three, for one of the others is all that you will see. And I understand what that means now. I understand the rest because you could be forgiven for thinking there was only one brother, the present. I mean, only, or the past or the future, or none of them at all, because each of them exists only when the others do. Golly, it's enough to make your head spin. But the riddle isn't finished yet, said the professor. What is this kingdom all the brothers rule together, that the one they themselves are? Momo looked baffled. What could it be? What did past, present, and future amount to, all lumped together? And she gazed around the great hall with its thousands upon thousands of clocks, and suddenly her face lit up. Time, she cried, clapping her hands and skipping for joy. That's what it is, time. And the house the brothers lived in, what would that be? The world, I suppose, Momo replied. Bravo, said the professor. I congratulate you, my girl. You are really good at solving riddles. I am delighted. Me too, said Momo, secretly wondering why he should be quite so pleased that she'd solved his riddle. He showed her many other rare and interesting things as they resumed their tour of the clock-filled hall, but the riddle still continued to occupy her thoughts. Tell me, she said eventually, what exactly is time? Well, you've just found that out for yourself, the professor replied. No, she said, I mean time itself. It exists, so it must be something, but what is it really? The professor smiled. It would be nice if you worked out your own answer to that question, too. Momo pondered for a long time. It exists, she mused. I mean, that much I do know, but you can't touch it or hold it. I mean, could it be something like a perfume? And then again, it's always passing by, so it must come from somewhere. I mean, perhaps it's like the wind. No, wait. Well, perhaps it's a kind of music you just don't hear because it's always there. And she paused and then added, though I have heard it sometimes, I think, very faintly. And the professor nodded. I know. That's why I was able to summon you here. But there must be more to it than that, said Momo, still pursuing her train of thought. Like the music comes from far off, but I seem to hear it deep inside of me. I mean, perhaps time works that way too. And she broke off bewildered. I mean, she said, like the wind making waves in the sea. She shrugged and shook her head. I expect I'm talking nonsense. Not at all, said the professor. I think you put it very prettily indeed. I mean, that's why I'm going to let you in on a secret. If you want to know, all the time in the world comes from here, from Nowhere House, Never Lane. Momo gazed at him in awe. I see. You mean you make it yourself? The professor smiled again. No, my child, I'm merely its custodian. All human beings have their allotted span of time, and my task is to see that it reaches them. Well, in that case, said Momo, why not simply arrange things so that they don't have any more of it stolen by the time thieves? I can't, the professor told her. What people do with their time is their own business. They must guard it themselves. I can only distribute it. Momo looked around the great hall. Is that why you keep all these clocks, one for every person in the world? No, Momo, these clocks are just a hobby of mine. They're very imperfect copies of something that everyone carries inside of them. Just as people have eyes to see light with and ears to hear sounds with, so they have hearts for the appreciation of time. And all the time they fail to appreciate is wasted on them, as the colors of the rainbow are wasted on a blind person, or the nightingale's song on the deaf one. Some hearts are unappreciative of time, I fear, though they beat like all the rest. Well, what will happen when my heart stops beating? Momo asked. When that moment comes, said the professor, time will stop for you as well, or rather, you will retrace your steps through time, through all the days and nights and months and years of your life until you go out through the great round silver gate you entered by. And what will I find on the other side? Well, the home of the music you've sometimes faintly heard in the distance. But by then you will be part of it. You yourself will be a note in its mighty harmonies. Professor Ora looked at Momo searchingly. But I don't suppose that makes much sense to you, does it? Yes, said Momo, I think so. And then recalling her strange progress along Never Lane and the way she'd lived through everything in reverse, she asks, Are you deaf? The professor smiled. If people knew the nature of death, he said after a moment's silence, they would cease to be afraid of it. And if they ceased to be afraid of it, no one would rob them of their time anymore. Why not tell them then? Momo suggested. I already do. I tell them the meaning of death with every hour I send them, but they refuse to listen. They would sooner heed those who frighten them, and that's another riddle in itself. I'm not frightened. Professor Ora nodded slowly, and he gave her another searching stare. And then he said, Would you like to see where time comes from? Yes, she whispered. Well, I will take you there, said the professor, but only if you promise not to talk or ask questions. Is that understood? Momo nodded. And so Professor Ora stooped and picked her up, and all at once he seemed immensely tall and inexpressibly old, but not as a man grows old, more in the manner of an ancient tree or primeval crag. And clasping Momo with one arm, he covered her eyes with his other hand so gently that it felt as if snowflakes were landing on her cheeks like icy thistledown. And Momo sensed that he was striding down a long, dark tunnel, but she felt quite safe and utterly unafraid. And at first she thought she could hear her own heartbeats, but then she became more and more convinced that they were really the echoes of the professor's footsteps. And after what seemed like a very long time, he put Momo down. His face was close to hers when he removed his hand from her eyes, and he gave her a meaningful look and put a finger to his lips. And then he straightened up and stepped back. Everything was bathed in a sort of golden twilight. And when her eyes became accustomed to it, Momo saw that she was standing beneath a mighty dome, as big as the vault of heaven itself, or so it seemed to her, and that whole of the dome was made of the purest gold. High overhead, in the very center of the dome, was a circular opening through which a shaft of light fell straight on to an equally circular lake whose dark, smooth waters resembled a jet black mirror. And just above the surface, glittering in the shaft of light with the brilliance of a star, something was slowly and majestically moving back and forth. And Momo saw it was a gigantic pendulum, but one with no visible means of support, apparently weightless, and it soared and swooped above the mirror-smooth water with bird-like ease. As the glittering pendulum slowly neared the edge of the lake, an enormous water lily bud emerged from its dark depths. The closer the pendulum came, the wider it opened until at last it lay full blown on the surface. Momo had never seen so exquisite a flower. It was composed of all the colors in the spectrum, brilliant colors such as Momo had never dreamed of. And while the pendulum hovered above it, she became so absorbed in the spectacle that she forgot everything else. And the scent alone seemed something she had always craved without knowing what it was. But then, very slowly, the pendulum swung back, and as it did, so Momo saw to her dismay that the glorious flower was beginning to wilt, and petal after petal dropped off and sank into the blackness below. And to Momo, it was as if something unutterably dear to her was vanishing beyond recall. And by the time the pendulum reached the center of the lake, the flower had completely disintegrated, And at that moment, however, a new bud arose near the opposite shore, and as the pendulum drew nearer, Momo saw that it was an even lovelier blossom that was beginning to unfold. She walked around the lake to inspect it more closely. This new flower was altogether different from its predecessor. Momo had never seen such colors before, but these colors seemed richer and more exquisite by far. The petals, too, gave off a different and far more delicious scent, and the longer Momo studied them, the more marvelous every detail she found. But again, the glittering pendulum swung back, and as it did so, the glorious blossom withered and sank, petal by petal, into the dark and unfathomable depths of the lake. And slowly, very slowly, the pendulum proceeded on its way, but not to exactly the same place as before. This time it checked its swing a little further along the shore, and there, one pace from where it had previously paused, another bud arose and unfolded. And to Momo, this seemed the loveliest lily of all. I mean, the flower of flowers, a positive miracle. She could have wept aloud with this perfect blossom, too, began to fade and subside into the depths. But she remembered her promise to the Professor Hora and said no sound. Meanwhile, the pendulum returned to the opposite shore, another pace furthering along, and fresh buds broke the surface. And as time went by, it dawned on Momo that each new blossom differed entirely from those that had gone before, and that it always seemed the most beautiful of all. And she wandered around the lake, watching flower after flower unfold and die. And although she felt she would never tire of the spectacle, she gradually became aware of another marvel, one that had escaped her until now. She could not only see the shaft of light that streamed down from the center of the dome, she could hear it as well. At first, it reminded her of the wind whistling in distant treetops, but the sound swelled until it resembled the roar of a waterfall or thunder of waves breaking on a rocky shore. More and more clearly, Momo perceived that this mighty sound consisted of innumerable notes whose constant changes of pitch were forever weaving different harmonies. It was music, and yet it was also something else. And all at once, she recognized it as the faraway music she had sometimes faintly heard while listening to the silence of a starry night. But by now, as the sounds became ever clearer and more glorious, she sensed that it was the resonant shaft of light that summoned each bud from the dark depths of the lake and fashioned it into a flower of unique and inimitable beauty. The longer she listened, the more clearly she could make out individual voices, not human voices, but notes such as might have been given forth by gold and silver and every precious metal in existence. And then beyond them, as if it were, voices of quite another kind made themselves heard, infinitely remote, yet indescribably powerful, and they gained strength. Momo began to distinguish words uttered in a language she had never heard before, but she could nonetheless understand. And the sun and moon and planets and stars were telling her their own true names, and their names signified what they did and how they all combined to make each hour lily flower and fade in turn. They all combined to make each hour lily flower and fade in turn. And suddenly Momo realized that all of these words were directed at her. And from where she stood to the most distant star in space, the entire universe was focused on her like a single face of an unimaginable size, looking at her and talking to her. And what overcame her then was something more than fear. A moment later, she caught sight of Professor Hora silently beckoning to her, and she ran to him and buried her face in his chest. And taking her in his arms, he put one hand over her eyes as before, light as thistledown, and carried her back along the endless tunnel. And again, all seemed dark, but again she felt snug and secure. And once they were back in the little clock-lined room, he laid her down on the sofa. Professor Hora, Momo whispered, I never knew that everyone's time was so. She strove to find the right word, but in vain. So big, she said eventually. What you've just seen and heard wasn't everyone's time, the professor replied. It was only your own. There is a place like that, the one you visited, in every living soul. But only those who let me take them there can reach it, nor can it be seen with ordinary eyes. So where was I?
in the depths of your own heart, said the professor gently, stroking her tousled hair. Professor Hora, she whispered again, may I bring my friends to see you, too? No, he said, not yet. That isn't possible. How long can I stay with you then? Until you feel it's time to rejoin your friends, my child. But I may tell them what may I tell them what the stars were saying? You may, but you won't be able to. Why not? Because before you can, the words must take root inside of you. But I want to tell them, all of them. I want to sing them what the voice is saying, and then everything would come right again, I think. If that's really what you want, Momo, you must learn to wait. I don't mind waiting. I mean, wait like a seed that must slumber in the earth before it can sprout. That's how long the words will take to grow up inside of you. Is that what you want? Yes, she whispered. Then sleep, said Professor Hora, gently passing his hand across her eyes. Sleep. And Momo heaved a deep and contented sigh and fell asleep. And that's the end of part 2. Just a little weepy. Thanks for joining me, everybody. I'll try to keep out this more regularly. We'll do a part 5 and next starts the hour lilies. All right. Good night, everybody.